This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Music and text recorded by Toria's uncle. Chapter 12. Of Alexander Crummell. Then from the dawn it seemed there came, but faint, as from beyond the limit of the world, like the last echo born of a great cry, sounds as if some fair city were one voice around a king returning from his wars. Tennyson. This is the story of a human heart, the tale of a black boy who many long years ago began to struggle with life that he might know the world and know himself. 3 temptations he met on those dark dunes that lay gray and dismal before the wonder eyes of the child. The temptation of hate that stood out against the red dawn, the temptation of despair that darkened noonday, and the temptation of doubt that ever steals along with twilight. Above all, you must hear of the vales he crossed, the valley of humiliation and the valley of the shadow of death. I saw Alexander Crummell first at a Wilberforce commencement season, amid its bustle and crush. Tall, frail, and black he stood, with simple dignity and an unmistakable air of good breeding. I talked with him apart, where the storming of the lusty young orators could not harm us. I spoke to him politely, then curiously, then eagerly, as I began to feel the fineness of his character, his calm courtesy, the sweetness of his strength, and his fair blending of the hope and truth of life. Instinctively, I bowed before this man as one bows before the prophets of the world. Some seer he seemed, that came not from the crimson past or the gray to come, but from the pulsing now, that mocking world which seemed to me at once so light and dark, so splendid and sordid. 80 years had he wandered in this same world of mine within the Veil. He was born with the Missouri Compromise, and lay a-dying amid the echoes of Manila and El Caney, stirring times for living, times dark to look back upon, darker to look forward to. The black-faced lad that paused over his mud and marbles 70 years ago saw puzzling vistas as he looked down the world. The slave ships still groaned across the Atlantic. Faint cries burdened the southern breeze, and the great black father whispered mad tales of cruelty into those young ears. From the low doorway the mother silently watched her boy at play, and at nightfall sought him eagerly, lest the shadows should bear him away to the land of slaves. So his young mind worked and winced and shaped curiously a vision of life, and in the midst of that vision ever stood one dark figure alone, ever with the hard, thick countenance of that bitter father, and a form that fell in vast and shapeless folds. Thus the temptation of hate grew and shadowed the growing child, gliding stealthily into his laughter, fading into his play, and seizing his dreams by day and night with rough, rude turbulence. So the black boy asked of sky and sun and flower the never answered, "Why?" and loved, as he grew, neither the world nor the world's rough ways. Strange temptation for a child, you may think. And yet in this wide land today 1,000,000 dark children brood before this same temptation, and feel its cold and shuddering arms. For them perhaps someone will some day lift the veil, will come tenderly and cheerily into those sad little lives and brush the brooding hate away, just as Beriah Green strode in upon the life of Alexander Crummell. And before the bluff, kind-hearted man, the shadow seemed less dark. Beriah Green had a school in Oneida County, New York, with a score of mischievous boys. "I'm going to bring a black boy here to educate," said Beriah Green, as only a crank and an abolitionist would have dared to say. "Ho ho!" laughed the boys. "Yes," said his wife, and Alexander came. Once before the black boy had sought a school, had traveled cold and hungry 400 miles up into free New Hampshire, to Canaan. But the godly farmers hitched 90 yoke of oxen to the abolition schoolhouse and dragged it into the middle of the swamp. The black boy trudged away. The 19th was the first century of human sympathy, the age when half-wonderingly we began to descry in others that transfigured spark of divinity which we call myself; when clodhoppers and peasants and tramps and thieves and millionaires and sometimes Negroes became throbbing souls whose warm pulsing life touched us so nearly that we half gasped with surprise, crying, "Thou too? Hast thou seen sorrow and the dull waters of hopelessness? Hast thou known life?" And then all helplessly we peered into those other worlds and wailed, "O world of worlds, how shall man make you one?" So in that little Oneida school there came to those schoolboys a revelation of thought and longing beneath one black skin, of which they had not dreamed before. And to the lonely boy came a new dawn of sympathy and inspiration. The shadowy, formless thing, the temptation of hate that hovered between him and the world, grew fainter and less sinister. It did not wholly fade away, but diffused itself and lingered thick at the edges. Through it the child now first saw the blue and gold of life, the sun-swept road that ran twixt the heaven and earth until, in one far-off, wan, wavering line, they met and kissed. A vision of life came to the growing boy, mystic, wonderful. He raised his head, stretched himself, breathed deep of the fresh new air. Yonder, behind the forests, he heard strange sounds. Then, glinting through the trees, he saw far, far away the bronzed hosts of a nation calling, calling faintly, calling loudly. He heard the hateful clank of their chains. He felt them cringe and grovel, and there rose within him a protest and a prophecy, and he girded himself to walk down the world. A voice and vision called him to be a priest, a seer to lead the uncalled out of the house of bondage. He saw the headless host turn toward him like the whirling of mad waters. He stretched forth his hands eagerly, and then, even as he stretched them, suddenly there swept across the vision the temptation of despair. They were not wicked men. The problem of life is not the problem of the wicked. They were calm, good men, bishops of the Apostolic Church of God, and strove toward righteousness. They said slowly, "It is all very natural, it is even commendable, but the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church cannot admit a Negro." And when that thin, half-grotesque figure still haunted their doors, they put their hands kindly, half sorrowfully, on his shoulders, and said, "Now, of course, we know how you feel about it, but you see it is impossible. That is, well, it is premature. Sometime we trust, sincerely trust, all such distinctions will fade away, but now the world is as it is." This was the temptation of despair, and the young man fought it doggedly. Like some grave shadow he flitted by those halls, pleading, arguing, half angrily demanding admittance, until there came the final "no," until men hustled the disturber away, marked him as foolish, unreasonable, and injudicious, a vain rebel against God's law. And then from that vision splendid, all the glory slowly faded away, and left an earth gray and stern, rolling on beneath a dark despair. Even the kind hands that stretched themselves toward him from out the depths of that dull morning seemed but parts of the purple shadows. He saw them coldly, and asked, "Why should I strive by special grace, when the way of the world is closed to me?" All gently yet, the hands urged him on, the hands of young John Jay, that daring father's daring son, the hands of the good folk of Boston, that free city. And yet, with a way to the priesthood of the church open at last before him, the cloud lingered there. And even when in old St. Paul's the venerable bishop raised his white arms above the Negro deacon, even then the burden had not lifted from that heart, for there had passed a glory from the earth. And yet the fire through which Alexander Crummell went did not burn in vain. Slowly and more soberly he took up again his plan of life. More critically he studied the situation. Deep down below the slavery and servitude of the Negro people, he saw their fatal weaknesses, which long years of mistreatment had emphasized. The dearth of strong moral character, of unbending righteousness, he felt, was their great shortcoming. And here he would begin. He would gather the best of his people into some little Episcopal chapel, and there lead, teach, and inspire them, till the leaven spread, till the children grew, till the world hearkened, till, and then across his dream gleamed some faint afterglow of that first fair vision of youth, only an afterglow, for there had passed a glory from the earth. One day, it was in 1842, and the springtide was struggling merrily with the May winds of New England, he stood at last in his own chapel in Providence, a priest of the church. The days sped by, and the dark young clergyman labored. He wrote his sermons carefully, he intoned his prayers with a soft, earnest voice. He haunted the streets and accosted the wayfarers. He visited the sick and knelt beside the dying. He worked and toiled, week by week, day by day, month by month. And yet month by month the congregation dwindled. Week by week the hollow walls echoed more sharply. Day by day the calls came fewer and fewer. And day by day the third temptation sat clearer and still more clearly within the veil, a temptation as it were bland and smiling, with just a shade of mockery in its smooth tones. First it came casually in the cadence of a voice, "Oh, colored folks, yes." Or perhaps more definitely, "What do you expect?" In voice and gesture lay the doubt, the temptation of doubt. How he hated it, and stormed at it furiously. Of course they are capable, he cried. Of course they can learn and strive and achieve. And of course, added the temptation softly, they do nothing of the sort. Of all the three temptations, this one struck the deepest. Hate, he had outgrown so childish a thing. Despair, he had steeled his right arm against it and fought it with the vigor of determination. But to doubt the worth of his life work, to doubt the destiny and capability of the race his soul loved because it was his, to find listless squalor instead of eager endeavor, to hear his own lips whispering, "They do not care, they cannot know, they are dumb-driven cattle. Why cast your pearls before swine?" This seemed more than man could bear, and he closed the door and sank upon the steps of the chancel and cast his robe upon the floor and writhed. The evening sunbeams had set the dust to dancing in the gloomy chapel when he arose. He folded his vestments, put away the hymn books, and closed the great Bible. He stepped out into the twilight, looked back upon the narrow little pulpit with a weary smile, and locked the door. Then he walked briskly to the bishop and told the bishop what the bishop already knew. "I have failed," he said simply, and gaining courage by the confession, he added, "What I need is a larger constituency. There are comparatively few Negroes here, and perhaps they are not of the best. I must go where the field is wider and try again." So the bishop sent him to Philadelphia with a letter to Bishop Onderdonk. Bishop Onderdonk lived at the head of 6 white steps, corpulent, red-faced, and the author of several thrilling tracts on apostolic succession. It was after dinner, and the bishop had settled himself for a pleasant season of contemplation, when the bell must needs ring, and there must burst in upon the bishop a letter and a thin, ungainly Negro. Bishop Onderdonk read the letter hastily and frowned. Fortunately, his mind was already clear on this point, and he cleared his brow and looked at Crummell. Then he said slowly and impressively, "I will receive you into this diocese on one condition: no Negro priest can sit in my church convention, and no Negro church must ask for a representation there." I sometimes fancy that I can see that tableau: the frail black figure nervously twitching his hat before the massive abdomen of Bishop Onderdonk, his threadbare coat thrown against the dark woodwork of the bookcases, where Fox's Lives of the Martyrs nestled happily beside The Whole Duty of Man. I seem to see the wide eyes of the Negro wander past the bishop's broadcloth to where the swinging glass doors of the cabinet glow in the sunlight. A little blue fly is trying to cross the yawning keyhole. He marches briskly up to it, peers into the chasm in a surprised sort of way, and rubs his feelers reflectively. Then he essays its depths, and finding it bottomless, draws back again. The dark-faced priest finds himself wondering if the fly, too, has faced its valley of humiliation, and if it will plunge into it, when lo, it spreads its tiny wings and buzzes merrily across, leaving the watcher wingless and alone. Then the full weight of his burden fell upon him. The rich walls wheeled away, and before him lay the cold, rough moor winding on through life, cut in twain by one thick granite ridge. Here the valley of humiliation, yonder the valley of the shadow of death. And I know not which be darker, no, not I. But this I know: in yonder vale of the humble stand today 1,000,000 swarthy men, who willingly would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the worthy takes. All this and more would they bear, did they but know that this were sacrifice, and not a meaner thing. So surged the thought within that lone black breast. The bishop cleared his throat suggestively, then, recollecting that there was really nothing to say, considerately said nothing, only sat tapping his foot impatiently. But Alexander Crummell said, slowly and heavily, "I will never enter your diocese on such terms." And saying this, he turned and passed into the valley of the shadow of death. You might have noted only the physical dying, the shattered frame and hacking cough, but in that soul lay deeper death than that. He found a chapel in New York, the church of his father. He labored for it in poverty and starvation, scorned by his fellow priests. Half in despair, he wandered across the sea, a beggar with outstretched hands. Englishmen clasped them, Wilberforce and Stanley, Thirlwell and Inglis, even Froude and Macaulay. Sir Benjamin Brodie bade him rest a while at Queen's College in Cambridge, and there he lingered, struggling for health of body and mind until he took his degree in '53. Restless still and unsatisfied, he turned toward Africa, and for long years, amid the spawn of the slave smugglers, sought a new heaven and a new earth. So the man groped for light. All this was not life; it was the world wandering of a soul in search of itself, the striving of one who vainly sought his place in the world, ever haunted by the shadow of a death that is more than death, the passing of a soul that has missed its duty. 20 years he wandered, 20 years and more, and yet the hard rasping question kept gnawing within him, "What in God's name am I on earth for?" In the narrow New York parish his soul seemed cramped and smothered. In the fine old air of the English University he heard the millions wailing over the sea. In the wild fever-cursed swamps of West Africa he stood helpless and alone. You will not wonder at his weird pilgrimage, you who in the swift whirl of living, amid its cold paradox and marvelous vision, have fronted life and asked its riddle face to face. And if you find that riddle hard to read, remember that yonder black boy finds it just a little harder. If it is difficult for you to find and face your duty, it is a shade more difficult for him. If your heart sickens in the blood and dust of battle, remember that to him the dust is thicker and the battle fiercer. No wonder the wanderers fall. No wonder we point to thief and murderer and haunting prostitute and the never-ending throng of unhearsed dead. The valley of the shadow of death gives few of its pilgrims back to the world. But Alexander Crummell, it gave back. Out of the temptation of hate, and burned by the fire of despair, triumphant over doubt, and steeled by sacrifice against humiliation, he turned at last home across the waters, humble and strong, gentle and determined. He bent to all the jibes and prejudices, to all hatred and discrimination, with that rare courtesy which is the armor of pure souls. He fought among his own, the low, the grasping, and the wicked, with that unbending righteousness which is the sword of the just. He never faltered, he seldom complained. He simply worked, inspiring the young, rebuking the old, helping the weak, guiding the strong. So he grew, and brought within his wide influence all that was best of those who walk within the Veil. They who live without knew not nor dreamed of that full power within, that mighty inspiration which the dull gauze of caste decreed that most men should not know. And now that he is gone, I sweep the veil away and cry, Lo, the soul to whose dear memory I bring this little tribute. I can see his face still, dark and heavy-lined beneath his snowy hair, lighting and shading, now with inspiration for the future, now in innocent pain at some human wickedness, now with sorrow at some hard memory from the past. The more I met Alexander Crummell, the more I felt how much that world was losing which knew so little of him. In another age he might have sat among the elders of the land in purple-bordered toga. In another country mothers might have sung him to the cradles. He did his work, he did it nobly and well, and yet I sorrow that here he worked alone with so little human sympathy. His name today in this broad land means little, and comes to 50 million ears laden with no incense of memory or emulation. And herein lies the tragedy of the age. Not that men are poor, all men know something of poverty. Not that men are wicked, who is good? Not that men are ignorant, what is truth? Nay, but that men know so little of men. He sat one morning gazing toward the sea. He smiled and said, "The gate is rusty on the hinges." That night at starrise a wind came moaning out of the west to blow the gate ajar. And then the soul I loved fled like a flame across the seas, and in its seat sat Death. I wonder where he is today. I wonder if in that dim world beyond, as he came gliding in, there rose on some wan throne a king, a dark and pierced Jew, who knows the writhings of the earthly damned, saying, as he laid those heart-wrung talents down, "Well done," while round about the morning stars sat singing. End of chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Music and text recorded by Toria's uncle. Chapter 13. Of the Coming of John. What bring they 'neath the midnight, beside the river sea? They bring the human heart wherein no nightly calm can be, that droppeth never with the wind, nor drieth with the dew. O calm it, God, thy calm is broad to cover spirits too. The river floweth on. Mrs. Browning. Carlisle Street runs westward from the center of Johnstown, across a great black bridge, down a hill and up again, by little shops and meat markets, past single-storied homes, until suddenly it stops against a wide green lawn. It is a broad, restful place, with two large buildings outlined against the west. When at evening the winds come swelling from the east, and the great pall of the city's smoke hangs wearily above the valley, then the red west glows like a dreamland down Carlisle Street, and at the tolling of the supper bell throws the passing forms of students in dark silhouette against the sky. Tall and black, they move slowly by, and seem in the sinister light to flit before the city like dim warning ghosts. Perhaps they are, for this is Wells Institute, and these black students have few dealings with the white city below. And if you'll notice, night after night there is one dark form that ever hurries, last and late, toward the twinkling lights of Swain Hall, for Jones is never on time. A long, straggling fellow he is, brown and hard-haired, who seems to be growing straight out of his clothes, and walks with a half-apologetic roll. He used perpetually to set the quiet dining room into waves of merriment as he stole to his place after the bell had tapped for prayers. He seemed so perfectly awkward, and yet one glance at his face made one forgive him much, that broad, good-natured smile in which lay no bit of art or artifice, but seemed just bubbling good nature and genuine satisfaction with the world. He came to us from Altamaha, away down there beneath the gnarled oaks of southeastern Georgia, where the sea croons to the sands, and the sands listen till they sink half-drowned beneath the waters, rising only here and there in long, low islands. The white folk of Altamaha voted John a good boy, fine plow hand, good in the rice fields, handy everywhere, and always good-natured and respectful. But they shook their heads when his mother wanted to send him off to school. "It'll spoil him, ruin him," they said, and they talked as though they knew. But full half the black folk followed him proudly to the station, and carried his queer little trunk and many bundles, and there they shook and shook hands, and the girls kissed him shyly, and the boys clapped him on the back. So the train came, and he pinched his little sister lovingly and put his great arms about his mother's neck, and then was away with a puff and a roar into the great yellow world that flamed and flared about the doubtful pilgrim. Up the coast they hurried, past the squares and palmettos of Savannah, through the cotton fields and through the weary night to Millville, and came with the morning to the noise and bustle of Johnstown. And they that stood behind that morning in Altamaha and watched the train as it noisily bore playmate and brother and son away to the world, had thereafter one ever-recurring word: "When John comes." Then what parties were to be, and what speakings in the churches, and what new furniture in the front room, perhaps even a new front room, and there would be a new schoolhouse, with John as teacher, and then perhaps a big wedding. All this and more, when John comes. But the white people shook their heads. At first he was coming at Christmas time, but the vacation proved too short. And then the next summer, but times were hard and schooling costly, and so instead he worked in Johnstown. And so it drifted to the next summer, and the next, till playmates scattered, and mother grew gray, and sister went up to the judge's kitchen to work. And still the legend lingered, when John comes. Up at the judge's they rather liked this refrain, for they too had a John, a fair-haired, smooth-faced boy who had played many a long summer's day to its close with his darker namesake. "Yes, sir, John is at Princeton, sir," said the broad-shouldered, gray-haired judge every morning as he marched down to the post office. "Showing the Yankees what a Southern gentleman can do," he added, and strode home again with his letters and his papers. Up at the great pillared house they lingered long over the Princeton letter, the judge and his frail wife, his sister and growing daughters. "It'll make a man of him," said the judge. "College is the place." And then he asked the shy little waitress, "Well, Jenny, how's your John?" and added reflectively, too bad your mother sent him off. It'll spoil him." And the waitress wondered. Thus in the faraway southern village the world lay waiting, half consciously, the coming of two young men, and dreamed in an inarticulate way of things that would be done and new thoughts that all would think. And yet it was singular that few thought of two Johns, for the black folk thought of one John, and he was black, and the white folk thought of another John, and he was white, and neither world thought the other world's thought, save with a vague unrest. Up in Johnstown at the Institute we were long puzzled at the case of John Jones. For a long time the clay seemed unfit for any sort of molding. He was loud and boisterous, always laughing and singing, and never able to work consecutively at anything. He did not know how to study, he had no idea of thoroughness, and with his tardiness, carelessness, and appalling good humor we were sore perplexed. One night we sat in faculty meeting, worried and serious, for Jones was in trouble again. This last escapade was too much, and so we solemnly voted that Jones, on account of repeated disorder and inattention to work, be suspended for the rest of the term. It seemed to us that the first time life ever struck Jones as a really serious thing was when the dean told him he must leave school. He stared at the gray-haired man blankly, with great eyes. Why," he faltered. "But I haven't graduated." Then the dean slowly and clearly explained, reminding him of the tardiness and the carelessness, of the poor lessons and neglected work, of the noise and disorder, until the fellow hung his head in confusion. Then he said quickly, "But you won't tell Mammy and sister? You won't write Mammy now, will you? For if you won't, I'll go out into the city and work, and come back next term and show you something." So the dean promised faithfully, and John shouldered his little trunk, giving neither word nor look to the giggling boys, and walked down Carlisle Street to the great city, with sober eyes and a set and serious face. Perhaps we imagined it, but some way it seemed to us that the serious look that crept over his boyish face that afternoon never left it again. When he came back to us, he went to work with all his rugged strength. It was a hard struggle, for things did not come easily to him. Few crowding memories of early life and teaching came to help him on his new way. But all the world toward which he strove was of his own building, and he builded slow and hard. As the light dawned lingeringly on his new creations, he sat rapt and silent before the vision, or wandered alone over the green campus, peering through and beyond the world of men into a world of thought. And the thoughts at times puzzled him sorely. He could not see just why the circle was not square, and carried it out 56 decimal places one midnight. Would have gone further, indeed, had not the matron rapped for lights out. He caught terrible colds lying on his back in the meadows of nights, trying to think out the solar system. He had grave doubts as to the ethics of the fall of Rome, and strongly suspected the Germans of being thieves and rascals, despite his textbooks. He pondered long over every new Greek word, and wondered why this meant that, and why it couldn't mean something else, and how it must have felt to think all things in Greek. So he thought and puzzled along for himself, pausing perplexed where others skipped merrily, and walking steadily through the difficulties where the rest stopped and surrendered. Thus he grew in body and soul, and with him his clothes seemed to grow and arrange themselves. Coat sleeves got longer, cuffs appeared, and collars got less soiled. Now and then his boots shone, and a new dignity crept into his walk, and we who saw daily a new thoughtfulness growing in his eyes began to expect something of this plodding boy. Thus he passed out of the preparatory school into college, and we who watched him felt 4 more years of change, which almost transformed the tall, grave man who bowed to us commencement morning. He had left his queer thought world and come back to a world of motion and of men. He looked now for the first time sharply about him, and wondered he had seen so little before. He grew slowly to feel almost for the first time the veil that lay between him and the white world. He first noticed now the oppression that had not seemed oppression before, differences that erstwhile seemed natural, restraints and slights that in his boyhood days had gone unnoticed or been greeted with a laugh. He felt angry now when men did not call him Mister. He clenched his hands at the Jim Crow cars, and chafed at the color line that hemmed in him and his. A tinge of sarcasm crept into his speech, and a vague bitterness into his life, and he sat long hours wondering and planning a way around these crooked things. Daily he found himself shrinking from the choked and narrow life of his native town, and yet he always planned to go back to Altamaha. He always planned to work there. Still more and more as the day approached he hesitated with a nameless dread, and even the day after graduation he seized with eagerness the offer of the dean to send him north with a quartet during the summer vacation to sing for the Institute. A breath of air before the plunge, he said to himself in half apology. It was a bright September afternoon, and the streets of New York were brilliant with moving men. They reminded John of the sea as he sat in the square and watched them, so changelessly changing, so bright and dark, so grave and gay. He scanned their rich and faultless clothes, the way they carried their hands, the shape of their hats. He peered into the hurrying carriages. Then, leaning back with a sigh, he said, "This is the world." The notion suddenly seized him to see where the world was going, since many of the richer and brighter seemed hurrying all one way. So when a tall, light-haired young man and a little talkative lady came by, he rose half hesitatingly and followed them. Up the street they went, past stores and gay shops, across a broad square, until with 100 others they entered the high portal of a great building. He was pushed toward the ticket office with the others, and felt in his pocket for the new $5 bill he had hoarded. There seemed really no time for hesitation, so he drew it bravely out, passed it to the busy clerk, and received simply a ticket, but no change. When at last he realized that he had paid $5 to enter he knew not what, he stood stock-still amazed. "Be careful," said a low voice behind him. "You must not lynch the colored gentleman simply because he's in your way." And a girl looked up roguishly into the eyes of her fair-haired escort. A shade of annoyance passed over the escort's face. "You will not understand us at the South," he said half impatiently, as if continuing with an argument. "With all your professions, one never sees in the North so cordial and intimate relations between white and black as are everyday occurrences with us. Why, I remember my closest playfellow in boyhood was a little Negro named after me, and surely no two—" "Well—" The man stopped short and flushed to the roots of his hair, for there, directly beside his reserved orchestra chairs, sat the Negro he had stumbled over in the hallway. He hesitated and grew pale with anger, called the usher, and gave him his card with a few peremptory words, and slowly sat down. The lady deftly changed the subject. All this John did not see, for he sat in a half-daze, minding the scene about him. The delicate beauty of the hall, the faint perfume, the moving myriad of men, the rich clothing and low hum of talking seemed all a part of a world so different from his. so strangely more beautiful than anything he had known, that he sat in dreamland, and started when, after a hush, rose high and clear the music of Lohengrin's swan. The infinite beauty of the wail lingered and swept through every muscle of his frame, and put it all atune. He closed his eyes and grasped the elbows of the chair, touching unwittingly the lady's arm, and the lady drew away. A deep longing swelled in all his heart to rise with that clear music out of the dirt and dust of that low life that held him prisoned and befouled. If he could only live up in the free air where the birds sang and the setting suns had no touch of blood. Who had called him to be the slave and butt of all? And if he had called, what right had he to call when a world like this lay open before men? Then the movement changed. A fuller, mightier harmony swelled away. He looked thoughtfully across the hall and wondered why the beautiful gray-haired woman looked so listless, and what the little man could be whispering about. He would not be listless and idle, he thought, for he felt with the music the movement of power within him. If he but had some master work, some life service, hard, aye bitter hard, but without the cringing and sickening servility, without the cruel hurt that hardened his heart and soul. When at last a soft sorrow swept across the violins, there came to him the vision of a far-off home, the great eyes of his sister, and the dark-drawn face of his mother. And his heart sank below the waters, even as the sea-sand sinks by the shores of Altamaha, only to be lifted aloft again with that last ethereal wail of the swan that quivered and faded away into the sky. It left John sitting so silent and rapt that he did not for some time notice the usher tapping him lightly on the shoulder and saying politely, "Will you step this way, please, sir?" A little surprised, he arose quickly at the last tap, and turning to leave his seat, looked full into the face of the fair-haired young man. For the first time the young man recognized his dark boyhood playmate, and John knew that it was the judge's son. The white John started, lifted his hand, and then froze into his chair. The black John smiled lightly, then grimly, and followed the usher down the aisle. The manager was sorry, very, very sorry, but he explained that some mistake had been made in selling the gentleman a seat already disposed of. He would refund the money, of course, and indeed felt the matter keenly, and so forth. And before he had finished, John was gone, walking hurriedly across the square and down the broad streets. And as he passed the park, he buttoned his coat and said, "John Jones, you're a natural-born fool." Then he went to his lodgings and wrote a letter, and tore it up. He wrote another, and threw it in the fire. Then he seized a scrap of paper and wrote, "Dear mother and sister, I am coming. John." "Perhaps," said John as he settled himself on the train, "perhaps I am to blame myself in struggling against my manifest destiny, simply because it looks hard and unpleasant. Here is my duty to Altamaha plain before me. Perhaps they'll let me settle the Negro problems there. Perhaps they won't. I will go into the king which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." And then he mused and dreamed and planned a life work, and the train flew south. Down in Altamaha, after 7 long years, all the world knew John was coming. The homes were scrubbed and scoured, above all one. The gardens and yards had an unwonted trimness, and Jenny bought a new gingham. With some finesse and negotiation, all the dark Methodists and Presbyterians were induced to join in a monster welcome at the Baptist church. And as the day drew near, warm discussions arose on every corner as to the exact extent and nature of John's accomplishments. It was noontide on a gray and cloudy day when he came. The black town flocked to the depot, with a little of the white at the edges. A happy throng, with "Good mornings" and "Howdies," and laughing and joking and jostling. Mother sat yonder in the window watching, but Sister Jenny stood on the platform, nervously fingering her dress, tall and lithe, with soft brown skin and loving eyes, peering from out a tangled wilderness of hair. John rose gloomily as the train stopped, for he was thinking of the Jim Crow car. He stepped to the platform and paused. A little dingy station, a black crowd, gaudy and dirty, A half-mile of dilapidated shanties along a straggling ditch of mud. An overwhelming sense of the sordidness and narrowness of it all seized him. He looked in vain for his mother, kissed coldly the tall, strange girl who called him brother, spoke a short, dry word here and there, then, lingering neither for handshaking nor gossip, started silently up the street, raising his hat merely to the last eager old auntie, to her open-mouthed astonishment. The people were distinctly bewildered. This silent, cold man, was this John? Where was his smile and hearty hand grasp? "'Peared kind of down in the mouth," said the Methodist preacher thoughtfully. "Seems monstrous stuck up," complained a Baptist sister. But the white postmaster from the edge of the crowd expressed the opinion of his folks plainly. "That damn nigger," said he, as he shouldered the mail and arranged his tobacco, "has gone north and got plumb full of fool notions, but they won't work in Altamaha." And the crowd melted away. The meeting of welcome at the Baptist church was a failure. Rain spoiled the barbecue, and thunder turned the milk in the ice cream. When the speaking came at night, the house was crowded to overflowing. The three preachers had especially prepared themselves, but somehow John's manner seemed to throw a blanket over everything. He seemed so cold and preoccupied, and had so strange an air of restraint, that the Methodist brother could not warm up to his theme, and elicited not a single amen. The Presbyterian prayer was but feebly responded to, and even the Baptist preacher, though he wakened faint enthusiasm, got so mixed up in his favorite sentence that he had to close by stopping fully 15 minutes sooner than he meant. The people moved uneasily in their seats as John rose to reply. He spoke slowly and methodically. The age, he said, demanded new ideas. We were far different from those men of the 17th and 18th centuries, with broader ideas of human brotherhood and destiny. Then he spoke of the rise of charity and popular education, and particularly the spread of wealth and work. The question was then, he added reflectively, looking at the low discolored ceiling, what part the Negroes of this land would take in the striving of the new century. He sketched in vague outline the new industrial school that might rise among these pines. He spoke in detail of the charitable and philanthropic work that might be organized, of money that might be saved for banks and business. Finally, he urged unity, and deprecated especially religious and denominational bickering. "Today," he said with a smile, "the world cares little whether a man be Baptist or Methodist, or indeed a churchman at all, so long as he is good and true. What difference does it make whether a man be baptized in river or washbowl or not at all? Let's leave all that littleness and look higher." Then, thinking of nothing else, he slowly sat down. A painful hush seized that crowded mass. Little had they understood of what he said, for he spoke an unknown tongue, save the last word about baptism. That they knew. And they sat very still while the clock ticked. Then at last a low suppressed snarl came from the Amen corner, and an old bent man arose, walked over the seats, and climbed straight up into the pulpit. He was wrinkled and black, with scant gray and tufted hair. His voice and hands shook as with palsy, but on his face lay the intense, rapt look of the religious fanatic. He seized the Bible with his rough, huge hands. Twice he raised it, inarticulate, and then fairly burst into words with rude and awful eloquence. He quivered, swayed, and bent, then rose aloft in perfect majesty till the people moaned and wept, wailed and shouted, and a wild shrieking arose from the corners where all the pent-up feeling of the hour gathered itself and rushed into the air. John never knew clearly what the old man said. He only felt himself held up to scorn and scathing denunciation for trampling on the true religion. And he realized with amazement that all unknowingly he had put rough, rude hands on something this little world held sacred. He arose silently and passed out into the night. Down toward the sea he went, in the fitful starlight, half conscious of the girl who followed timidly after him. When at last he stood upon the bluff, he turned to his little sister and looked upon her sorrowfully, remembering with sudden pain how little thought he had given her. He put his arm about her and let her passion of tears spend itself on his shoulder. Long they stood together, peering over the gray, unresting water. "John," she said, "does it make everyone unhappy when they study and learn lots of things?" He paused and smiled. "I am afraid it does," he said. "And John, are you glad you studied?" "Yes," came the answer, slowly but positively. She watched the flickering lights upon the sea, and said thoughtfully, "I wish I was unhappy, and," putting both arms about his neck, "I think I am a little, John." It was several days later that John walked up to the judge's house to ask for the privilege of teaching the Negro school. The judge himself met him at the front door, stared a little hard at him, and said brusquely, "Go round to the kitchen door, John, and wait." Sitting on the kitchen steps, John stared at the corn, thoroughly perplexed. What on earth had come over him? Every step he made offended someone. He had come to save his people, and before he left the depot he had hurt them. He sought to teach them at the church, and had outraged their deepest feelings. He had schooled himself to be respectful to the judge, and then blundered into his front door. And all the time he had meant right. And yet somehow he found it so hard and strange to fit his old surroundings again, to find his place in the world about him. He could not remember that he used to have any difficulty in the past, when life was glad and gay. The world seemed smooth and easy then. Perhaps. But his sister came to the kitchen door just then and said the judge awaited him. The judge sat in the dining room amid his morning's mail, and he did not ask John to sit down. He plunged squarely into the business. "You've come for the school, I suppose? Well, John, I want to speak to you plainly. You know I'm a friend to your people. I've helped you and your family, and would have done more if you hadn't got the notion of going off. Now, I like the colored people, and sympathize with all their reasonable aspirations, but you and I both know, John, that in this country the Negro must remain subordinate, and can never expect to be the equal of white men. In their place, your people can be honest and respectful, and God knows I'll do what I can to help them. But when they want to reverse nature and rule white men and marry white women and sit in my parlor, then by God we'll hold them under if we have to lynch every nigger in the land. Now, John, the question is, are you, with your education and northern notions, going to accept the situation and teach the darkies to be faithful servants and laborers, as your fathers were? I knew your father, John. He belonged to my brother, and he was a good nigger. Well, are you going to be like him? Or are you going to try to put fool ideas of rising and equality into these folks' head and make them discontented and unhappy?" "I am going to accept the situation, Judge Henderson," answered John, with a brevity that did not escape the keen old man. He hesitated a moment, and then said shortly, "Very well. We'll try you a while. Good morning." It was a full month after the opening of the Negro school that the other John came home, tall, gay, and headstrong. The mother wept, the sisters sang, the whole white town was glad. A proud man was the judge, and it was a goodly sight to see the two swinging down Main Street together. And yet all did not go smoothly between them, for the younger man could not and did not veil his contempt for the little town, and plainly had his heart set on New York. Now the one cherished ambition of the judge was to see his son mayor of Altamaha, representative to the legislature, and, who could say, governor of Georgia. So the argument often waxed hot between them. "Good heavens, father," the younger man would say after dinner, as he lighted a cigar and stood by the fireplace, "you surely don't expect a young fellow like me to settle down permanently in this God-forsaken town with nothing but mud and Negroes?" "I did," the judge would answer laconically, and on this particular day it seemed from the gathering scowl that he was about to add something more emphatic. But neighbors had already begun to drop in to admire his son, and the conversation drifted. "Hear that John is livening things up at the darky school," volunteered the postmaster after a pause. "What now?" asked the judge sharply. "Oh, nothing in particular. Just his almighty air and uppish ways. Believe I did hear something about his giving talks on the French Revolution, equality, and such like. He's what I call a dangerous nigger. Have you heard him say anything out of the way?" "Why, no. But Sally, our girl, told my wife a lot of rot. Then, too, I don't need to hear. A nigger what won't say sir to a white man, or—" "Who is this John?" interrupted the son. "Why, it's little black John, Peggy's son, your old playfellow." The young man's face flushed angrily, and then he laughed. "Oh," said he, "it's the darky that tried to force himself into a seat beside the lady I was escorting." But Judge Henderson waited to hear no more. He had been nettled all day, and now at this he rose with a half-smothered oath, took his hat and cane, and walked straight to the schoolhouse. For John it had been a long, hard pull to get things started in the rickety old shanty that sheltered his school. The Negroes were rent into factions for and against him. The parents were careless, the children irregular and dirty, and books, pencils, and slates largely missing. Nevertheless, he struggled hopefully on, and seemed to see at last some glimmering of dawn. The attendance was larger, and the children were a shade cleaner this week. Even the booby class in reading showed a little comforting progress. So John settled himself with renewed patience this afternoon. "Now, Mandy," he said cheerfully, "that's better. But you mustn't chop your words up so. If the man goes— Why, your little brother even wouldn't tell a story that way, now would he?" "No, sir, he can't talk." "All right. Now let's try again. If the man— John!" The whole school started in surprise, and the teacher half arose, as the red, angry face of the judge appeared in the open doorway. "John, this school is closed. You children can go home and get to work. The white people of Altamaha are not spending their money on black folks to have their heads crammed with impudence and lies. Clear out! I'll lock the door myself." Up at the great pillared house, the tall young son wandered aimlessly about after his father's abrupt departure. In the house there was little to interest him. The books were old and stale, the local newspaper flat, and the women had retired with headaches and sewing. He tried a nap, but it was too warm, so he sauntered out into the fields, complaining disconsolately, "Good Lord, how long will this imprisonment last?" He was not a bad fellow, just a little spoiled and self-indulgent, and as headstrong as his proud father. He seemed a young man pleasant to look upon as he sat on the great black stump at the edge of the pines, idly swinging his legs and smoking. "Why, there isn't even a girl worth getting up a respectable flirtation with," he growled. Just then his eye caught a tall, willowy figure hurrying toward him on the narrow path. He looked with interest at first, and burst into a laugh as he said, "Well, I declare, if it isn't Jenny, the little brown kitchen maid. Why, I never noticed before what a trim little body she is." "Hello, Jenny. Why haven't you kissed me since I came home?" he said gaily. The young girl stared at him in surprise and confusion, faltered something inarticulate, and attempted to pass. But a willful mood had seized the young idler, and he caught her arm. Frightened, she slipped by, and half mischievously he turned and ran after her through the tall pines. Yonder toward the sea, at the end of the path, came John slowly with his head down. He had turned wearily homeward from the schoolhouse, then, thinking to shield his mother from the blow, started to meet his sister as she came home from work and break the news of his dismissal to her. "I'll go away," he said slowly. "I'll go away and find work and send for them. I cannot live here longer." And then the fierce, buried anger surged up into his throat. He waved his arms and hurried wildly up the path. The great brown sea lay silent. The air scarce breathed. The dying day bathed the twisted oaks and mighty pines in black and gold, and there came from the wind no warning, not a whisper from the cloudless sky. There was only a black man hurrying on with an ache in his heart, seeing neither sun nor sea, but starting as from a dream at the frightened cry that woke the pines, to see his dark sister struggling in the arms of a tall and fair-haired man. He said not a word, but seizing a fallen limb, struck him with all the pent-up hatred of his great black arm, and the body lay white and still beneath the pines, all bathed in sunshine and in blood. John looked at it dreamily, then walked back to the house briskly, and said in a soft voice, "Mammy, I'm going away. I'm going to be free." She gazed at him dimly and faltered, "North, honey? You going north again?" He looked out where the North Star glistened pale above the waters and said, "Yes, Mammy, I'm going north." Then, without another word, he went out into the narrow lane, up by the straight pines, to the same winding path, and seated himself on the great black stump, looking at the blood where the body had lain. Yonder in the gray past he had played with that dead boy, romping together under the solemn trees. The night deepened. He thought of the boys at Johnstown. He wondered how Brown had turned out, and Carey, and Jones. Jones? Why, he was Jones. And he wondered what they would all say when they knew, in that great long dining room with its hundreds of merry eyes. Then, as the sheen of the starlight stole over him, he thought of the gilded ceiling of that vast concert hall, heard stealing toward him the faint, sweet music of the swan. Hark, was it music, or the hurry and shouting of men? Yes, surely. Clear and high, the faint, sweet melody rose and fluttered like a living thing, so that the very earth trembled as with the tramp of horses and the murmur of angry men. He leaned back and smiled toward the sea, whence rose the strange melody, away from the dark shadows where lay the noise of horses galloping, galloping on. With an effort he roused himself, bent forward, and looked steadily down the pathway, softly humming the song of the bride. Freudig gefrot, sie het dahin. Amid the trees, in the dim morning twilight, he watched their shadows dancing and heard their horses thundering toward him, until at last they came sweeping like a storm, and he saw in front that haggard, white-haired man whose eyes flashed red with fury. Oh, how he pitied him, and wondered if he had the coiling, twisted rope. Then, as the storm burst round him, he rose slowly to his feet and turned his closed eyes toward the sea, and the world whistled in his ears. End of chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Music and text recorded by Toria's uncle. Chapter 14. Of the Sorrow Songs. I walk through the churchyard to lay this body down. I know moonrise, I know starrise. I walk in the moonlight, I walk in the starlight. I'll lie in the grave and stretch out my arms. I'll go to judgment in the evening of the day, and my soul and thy soul shall meet that day when I lay this body down. Negro Song. They that walked in darkness sang songs in the olden days, sorrow songs, for they were weary at heart. And so before each thought that I have written in this book, I have set a phrase, a haunting echo of these weird old songs in which the soul of the black slave spoke to men. Ever since I was a child, these songs have stirred me strangely. They came out of the South unknown to me, one by one, and yet at once I knew them as of me and of mine. Then in after years, when I came to Nashville, I saw the great temple builded of these songs towering over the pale city. To me Jubilee Hall seemed ever made of the songs themselves, and its bricks were red with the blood and dust of toil. Out of them rose for me, morning, noon, and night, bursts of wonderful melody, full of the voices of my brothers and sisters, full of the voices of the past. Little of beauty has America given the world, save the rude grandeur God Himself stamped on her bosom. The human spirit in this new world has expressed itself in vigor and ingenuity rather than in beauty, and so by fateful chance the Negro folk song, the rhythmic cry of the slave, stands today not simply as the sole American music, but as the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side the seas. It has been neglected, it has been and is half despised, and above all it has been persistently mistaken and misunderstood. But notwithstanding, it still remains as the singular spiritual heritage of the nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people. Away back in the 30s, the melody of these slave songs stirred the nation, but the songs were soon half forgotten. Some, like Near the Lake Where Drooped the Willow, passed into current airs, and their source was forgotten. Others were caricatured on the minstrel stage, and their memory died away. Then in wartime came the singular Port Royal experiment after the capture of Hilton Head, and perhaps for the first time the North met the Southern slave face to face and heart to heart with no third witness. The sea islands of the Carolinas where they met were filled with a black folk of primitive type, touched and molded less by the world about them than any others outside the Black Belt. Their appearance was uncouth, their language funny, but their hearts were human, and their singing stirred men with a mighty power. Thomas Wentworth Higginson hastened to tell of these songs, and Miss McKim and others urged upon the world their rare beauty. But the world listened only half credulously, until the Fisk Jubilee singers sang the slave songs so deeply into the world's heart that it can never wholly forget them again. There was once a blacksmith's son born at Cadiz, New York, who in the changes of time taught school in Ohio and helped defend Cincinnati from Kirby Smith. Then he fought at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, and finally served in the Freedmen's Bureau at Nashville. Here he formed a Sunday school class of black children in 1866, and sang with them and taught them to sing. And then they taught him to sing. And when once the glory of the Jubilee songs passed into the soul of George L. White, he knew his life work was to let those Negroes sing to the world as they had sung to him. So in 1871 the pilgrimage of the Fisk Jubilee singers began. North to Cincinnati they rode, 4 half-clothed black boys and 5 girl women, led by a man with a cause and a purpose. They stopped at Wilberforce, the oldest of Negro schools, where a black bishop blessed them. Then they went, fighting cold and starvation, shut out of hotels and cheerfully sneered at, ever northward, and ever the magic of their song kept thrilling hearts, until a burst of applause in the Congregational Council at Oberlin revealed them to the world. They came to New York, and Henry Ward Beecher dared to welcome them, even though the metropolitan dailies sneered at his "nigger minstrels." So their songs conquered, till they sang across the land and across the sea, before Queen and Kaiser, in Scotland and Ireland, Holland and Switzerland. 7 years they sang, and brought back $150,000 to found Fisk University. Since their day they have been imitated, sometimes well by the singers of Hampton and Atlanta, sometimes ill by straggling quartets. Caricature has sought again to spoil the quaint beauty of the music, and has filled the air with many debased melodies, which vulgar ears scarce know from the real. But the true Negro folk song still lives in the hearts of those who have heard them truly sung, and in the hearts of the Negro people. What are these songs, and what do they mean? I know little of music, and can say nothing in technical phrase, but I know something of men, and knowing them I know that these songs are the articulate message of the slave to the world. They tell us in these eager days that life was joyous to the black slave, careless and happy. I can easily believe this of some, of many, but not all the past South, though it rose from the dead, can gainsay the heart-touching witness of these songs. They are the music of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment. They tell of death and suffering and unvoiced longing toward a truer world, of misty wanderings and hidden ways. The songs are indeed the siftings of centuries. The music is far more ancient than the words, and in it we can trace here and there signs of development. My grandfather's grandmother was seized by an evil Dutch trader 2 centuries ago, and coming to the valleys of the Hudson and the Housatonic, black, little, and lithe, she shivered and shrank in the harsh north winds, looked longingly at the hills, and often crooned a heathen melody to the child between her knees, thus:
To bana kuba gene me To bana kuba gene me Ben nuli bendele.
The child sang it to his children, and they to their children's children, and so 200 years it has traveled down to us, and we sing it to our children, knowing as little as our fathers what its words may mean, but knowing well the meaning of its music. This was primitive African music. It may be seen in larger form in the strange chant which heralds the coming of John. You may bury me in the east, you may bury me in the west, but I'll hear the trumpet sound in that morning. The voice of exile. 10 master songs, more or less, one may pluck from the forest of melody songs of undoubted Negro origin and wide popular currency, and songs peculiarly characteristic of the slave. One of these I have just mentioned. Another whose strains begin this book is "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," when, struck with a sudden poverty, the United States refused to fulfill its promises of land to the freedmen. A brigadier general went down to the Sea Islands to carry the news. An old woman on the outskirts of the throng began singing this song. All the mass joined with her, swaying, and the soldier wept. The third song is the cradle song of death, which all men know, "Swing low, sweet chariot," whose bars begin the life story of Alexander Crummell. Then there is the song of many waters, "Roll, Jordan, roll," a mighty chorus with minor cadences. There were many songs of the fugitive, like that which opens "The Wings of Atalanta," and more familiar, "Been Listenin'." The seventh is the song of the end and the beginning, "My Lord, what a morning when the stars begin to fall." A strain of this is placed before the dawn of freedom. The song of groping, "My way's cloudy," begins the meaning of progress. The ninth is the song of this chapter, "Wrestlin' Jacob, the day is a breakin'," a paean of hopeful strife. The last master song is the song of songs, "Steal Away," sprung from the faith of the fathers. There are many others of the Negro folk songs as striking and characteristic as these, as, for instance, the 3 strains in the 3rd, 8th, and 9th chapters, and others I am sure could easily make a selection on more scientific principles. There are, too, songs that seem to be a step removed from the more primitive types. There is the maze-like medley, "Bright Sparkles," one phrase of which heads the Black Belt; the Easter Carol, "Dust, Dust, and Ashes;" the dirge, "My mother's took her flight and gone home," and that burst of melody hovering over the passing of the firstborn, "I hope my mother will be there in that beautiful world on high." These represent a third step in the development of the slave song, of which "You May Bury Me in the East" is the first, and songs like "March On," chapter 6, and steal away, are the second. The first is African music, the second Afro-American, while the third is a blending of Negro music with the music heard in the foster land. The result is still distinctively Negro, and the method of blending original, but the elements are both Negro and Caucasian. One might go further and find a fourth step in this development, where the songs of white America have been distinctively influenced by the slave songs, or have incorporated whole phrases of Negro melody, as Swanee River and Old Black Joe. Side by side, too, with the growth has gone the debasements and imitations, the Negro minstrel songs, many of the gospel hymns, and some of the contemporary coon songs, a mass of music in which the novice may easily lose himself and never find the real Negro melodies. In these songs, I have said, the slaves spoke to the world. Such a message is naturally veiled and half-articulate. Words and music have lost each other, and new and cant phrases of a dimly understood theology have displaced the older sentiment. Once in a while we catch a strange word of unknown tongue, as the mighty meal, which figures as a river of death. More often, slight words or mere doggerel are joined to music of singular sweetness. Purely secular songs are few in number, partly because many of them were turned into hymns by a change of words, partly because the frolics were seldom heard by the stranger, and the music less often caught. Of nearly all the songs, however, the music is distinctively sorrowful. The 10 master songs I have mentioned tell in word and music of trouble and exile, of strife and hiding. They grope toward some unseen power and sigh for rest in the end. The words that are left to us are not without interest, and cleared of evident dross, they conceal much of real poetry and meaning beneath conventional theology and unmeaning rhapsody. Like all primitive folk, the slave stood near to nature's heart. Life was a rough and rolling sea, like the brown Atlantic of the Sea Islands. The wilderness was the home of God, and the lonesome valley led to the way of life. Winter'll soon be over was the picture of life and death to a tropical imagination. The sudden wild thunderstorms of the South awed and impressed the Negroes. At times the rumbling seemed to them mournful, at times imperious. My Lord calls me, he calls me by the thunder, the trumpet sounds it in my soul. The monotonous toil and exposure is painted in many words. One sees the plowman in the hot, moist furrows singing, "There's no rain to wet you, there's no sun to burn you. Oh, push along, believer, I want to go home." The bowed and bent old man cries with thrice-repeated wail, "O Lord, keep me from sinking down." And he rebukes the devil of doubt, who can whisper, "Jesus is dead and God's gone away." Yet the soul hunger is there, the restlessness of the savage, the wail of the wanderer, and the plaint is put in one little phrase:
My soul wants something that's new, that's new.
Over the inner thoughts of the slaves and their relations one with another, the shadow of fear ever hung, so that we get but glimpses here and there, and also with them eloquent omissions and silences. Mother and child are sung, but seldom father. Fugitive and weary wanderer call for pity and affection, but there is little of wooing and wedding. The rocks and the mountains are well known, but home is unknown. Strange blending of love and helplessness sings through the refrain, "Yonder's my old mudder, been waggin' at the hill so long, 'bout time she cross over, get home by and by." Elsewhere comes the cry of the motherless, and the "Farewell, farewell, my only child." Love songs are scarce and fall into 2 categories, the frivolous and light, and the sad. Of deep, successful love there is ominous silence, and in one of the oldest of these songs there is a depth of history and meaning.
Poor Rosie, poor gal, poor Rosie, poor gal, Rosie break my poor heart, heaven shall be my home.
A black woman said of the song, "It can't be sung without a full heart and a troubled spirit." The same song sings here that sings in the German folk song, "Jetzt geh I ans Brunella, trink aber net." Of death the Negro showed little fear, but talked of it familiarly, and even fondly, as simply a crossing of the waters, perhaps, who knows, back to his ancient forests again. Later days transfigured his fatalism, and amid the dust and dirt the toiler sang, "Dust, dust and ashes fly over my grave, but the Lord shall bear my spirit home." The things evidently borrowed from the surrounding world undergo characteristic change when they enter the mouth of the slave. Especially is this true of Bible phrases. "Weep, O captive daughter of Zion," is quaintly turned into "Zion, weep alow," and the wheels of Ezekiel are turned every way into the mystic dreaming of the slave, till he says, "There's a little wheel a turning in my heart." As in olden time, the words of these hymns were improvised by some leading minstrel of the religious band. The circumstances of the gathering, however, the rhythm of the songs, and the limitations of allowable thought confined the poetry for the most part to single or double lines, and they seldom were expanded to quatrains or longer tales, although there are some few examples of sustained efforts, chiefly paraphrases of the Bible. 3 short series of verses have always attracted me. The one that heads this chapter, of one line of which Thomas Wentworth Higginson has fittingly said, "Never, it seems to me, since man first lived and suffered, was his infinite longing for peace uttered more plaintively." The second and third are descriptions of the Last Judgment. The one, a late improvisation with some traces of outside influence. "Oh, the stars and the elements are falling, and the moon drips away into blood, and the ransomed of the Lord are returning unto God. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And the other earlier and homelier picture from the low coast lands. "Michael, haul the boat ashore, then you'll hear the horn they blow, then you'll hear the trumpet sound, trumpets sound the world round, trumpets sound for rich and poor, trumpets sound the Jubilee, trumpets sound for you and me." Through all the sorrow of the sorrow songs there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Sometimes it is faith in life, sometimes a faith in death, sometimes assurance of boundless justice in some fair world beyond. But whichever it is, the meaning is always clear, that sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. Is such a hope justified? Do the sorrow songs sing true? The silently growing assumption of this age is that the probation of races is past, and that the backward races of today are of proven inefficiency and not worth the saving. Such an assumption is the arrogance of peoples irreverent toward time and ignorant of the deeds of men. 1,000 years ago such an assumption, easily possible, would have made it difficult for the Teuton to prove his right to life. 2,000 years ago such dogmatism, readily welcome, would have scouted the idea of blond races ever leading civilization. So woefully unorganized is sociological knowledge that the meaning of progress, the meaning of swift and slow in human doing, and the limits of human perfectibility are veiled, unanswered sphinxes on the shores of science. Why should Aeschylus have sung 2,000 years before Shakespeare was born? Why has civilization flourished in Europe and flickered, flamed, and died in Africa? So long as the world stands meekly dumb before such questions, shall this nation proclaim its ignorance and unhallowed prejudices, by denying freedom of opportunity to those who brought the sorrow songs to the seats of the mighty? Your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we have brought our three gifts and mingled them with yours: a gift of story and song, soft, stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land; the gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weak hands could have done it; the third, a gift of the Spirit. Around us the history of the land has centered for thrice 100 years. Out of the nation's heart we have called all that was best, to throttle and subdue all that was worst. Fire and blood, prayer and sacrifice have billowed over this people, and they have found peace only in the altars of the God of Right. Nor has our gift of the Spirit been merely passive. Actively we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. We fought their battles, shared their sorrows, mingled our blood with theirs, and generation after generation have pleaded with a headstrong, careless people to despise not justice, mercy, and truth, lest the nation be smitten with a curse. Our song, our toil, our cheer, and warning have been given to this nation in blood brotherhood. Are not these gifts worth the giving? Is not this work and striving? Would America have been America without her Negro people? Even so is the hope that sang in the songs of my fathers well sung. If somewhere in this whirling chaos of things there dwells eternal good, pitiful yet masterful, then anon in his good time America shall rend the veil, and the prisoned shall go free. Free, free as the sunshine trickling down the morning into these high windows of mine, free as yonder fresh young voices welling up to me from the caverns of brick and mortar below, swelling with song, instinct with life, tremulous treble and darkening bass. My children, my little children, are singing to the sunshine, and thus they sing.
Let us cheer the weary traveler, let us cheer the weary traveler, let us cheer the weary traveler along the heavenly way.
And the traveler girds himself and sets his face toward the morning and goes his way. The Afterthought. Hear my cry, O God the Reader. Vouchsafe that this my book fall not stillborn into the world wilderness. Let there spring, gentle one, from out its leaves vigor of thought and thoughtful deed to reap the harvest wonderful. Let the ears of a guilty people tingle with truth, and 70 millions sigh for the righteousness which exalteth nations, in this drear day when human brotherhood is mockery and a snare. Thus, in thy good time, may infinite reason turn the tangle straight, and these crooked marks on a fragile leaf be not indeed the end. This ends the reading of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The text and music of this book are in the public domain and were recorded by Toria's uncle.